Okay, everybody,
Okay,
I'm Dave Kendall. I'm the chair of the Missoula County Democrats. Apologize for the delay in getting started. We'll have a program here from till about 8 o'clock or so, a little bit later than that, and then we'll have our business meeting afterwards. So to introduce our speaker tonight, let me introduce Roberta Crane, our vice chair.
Hi, everybody, and I am really pleased to introduce Scott Bovard and Scott McNall from the Citizens Climate Lobby. I'm very glad they're here tonight to present a brief history of the Citizen Climate Lobby and explain the carbon fee and dividend proposal that they're working to get passed at the federal level this year. So let's give them a big welcoming hand.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll do my best to project. Anyway, thanks very much for getting this computer. I'm kind of the family joke that if anything can go wrong with technology, it'll go wrong with me. So you had a handicap, which was me. So I appreciate it. So I want to thank everybody for letting me come and talk to you today about a group I'm with called Citizens Climate Lobby, CCL, and some common goals that I know we all have. I think we all strongly believe that we need to really double down on issues that are important to our country and to our families, our children. And tonight I'm going to talk about what our group, Citizens Climate Lobby, calls a laser focus on a carbon fee and dividend. And we'll go through that in detail after we cover a few other things. But we think it's our best chance to address the climate change problem. My name is Scott Bovard, and I live here in Missoula. And I'm here with my good friend and neighbor, Scott McNall. He's the resident scholar. And he's here for moral support, and also, in case I misspeak, he's here to correct me and call me out if I use any alternative facts. Sue Tarpey has also been a huge help to us in the past, helping me put together this slide presentation. So I haven't seen Sue here. But anyway, I want to thank Sue as well, who helped facilitate this meeting with your group. I wanted to start out with a quote from E.B. White that we use in our CCL training. Every morning I wake up torn between a desire to save the world and an inclination to savor it. This makes it hard to plan the day. But if we forget to savor the world, what possible reason do we have for trying to save it? In a way, the savoring must come first. So we all have our stories about why we're interested in climate change. I have several, but I'll just share one. The reason I went to my training was I was skiing in a ski race, and instead of a snow skiing, it became water skiing. It was such a warm day in the end of February that literally we were skiing around puddles. And there was a vendor at the group, and 2 weeks later I was on my way to Salt Lake City for CCL training to learn about their methodology and their carbon fee and dividend proposal at a federal level. So we'll get into that. The other thing we have to kind of keep in mind, there are other people in this world that have views that maybe differ from what I expect is most common in this group. And and I don't mean to put Sarah Palin up there to ridicule her or make fun of her in any way. I actually put her up there as a reminder to me that one of the CCL requirements is that we always talk and show appreciation, admiration, and respect to all people that we talk to, politicians, whether we agree with them or not. So that's one of our main methodologies that we use. We feel like it's a better way to keep discussions going rather than be angry with each other. I did get on your website, and can I call you guys PDA? It's a lot easier to say PDA, Progressive Democrats of America. So that's Missoula County Democrats, I'm sorry. Missoula County Democrats, okay. So anyway, I was mistaken. I apologize for that. So, and you guys have a really broad platform. You talk about all different things like climate change, carbon tax, green energy, fracking, et cetera, nuclear issues. And you also have a list of coalition partners. Currently, CCL is not on this list, but I hope after you hear my discussion about our carbon fee and dividend, you can put us on your list of coalition partners. So what's it all about? for many people, what we savor the most is our relationship with our children and our grandchildren. And if all the things we know that are going to come about with climate change, sea level rise, drought, extreme weather, are things that are impacting people now and it will impact future generations. And so climate change is not a special interest, it's a human interest. And this is part of the reason I do what I do. This is my granddaughter, Ella Grace, and it just reminds me, I was listening to Audible, I don't know if anybody listens to Audible, but there's a section called The Science of Energy, and Dr. Weiss Session from Washington University in St. Louis was giving a presentation, and an elderly gentleman walked up to him and asked if he thought climate change would affect him in his lifetime. And the gentleman was older, so he said, I don't think it'll affect you in your lifetime. And the guy walked away and said, thank goodness I don't have any kids, so I really don't care. So I don't think that's a common attitude, but I think we need to keep this in our forefront with our actions and our policies. I've got a section on local climate change, but I think I'm preaching to the choir here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I think we know that depending on what part of the country you're in, there are climate changes that will affect different parts of the country. You know, here in Montana, you know, we're losing our glaciers. It's been a great snow year, so you know we can't really say that it hasn't been, but you know, snowpack is differing. Pine beetle infestation, and then of course you go to the coasts, and we've already got sea level rise. And I think they've got noticeable in Miami. In fact, one of the senators on the climate caucus that we'll talk about later, Carlos Curbelo, is from Miami, and he's a Republican. So I think people are starting to understand these things. So what do we know about climate change? And I don't know what this group knows about climate change, but I would guess it's probably fairly in-depth for most of you. But 97% of all climate scientists believe that climate change is happening and it's human-made, it's man-made. We can actually, one of our main board members, Catherine Hayhoe, is a trained climate scientist from Texas. She refuses to go on panels or discussions where it's her on one side and a climate change denier on the other, because it creates a perception that it's a one-on-one, where you would have to have 30 Catherine Hayhoes and one climate denier to make it accurate as far as the statistics. So we know if we trace fossil fuel records, extraction records back from the Industrial Revolution, we know roughly how much carbon has come out of the ground, and we know that that has caused atmospheric CO2 levels to rise, and unfortunately or unfortunately, a good percentage of this has gone into our oceans and has created acidification of the oceans. My wife just saw an article the other day that half of our coral reefs are gone on the planet, which is just, you know, devastating. So we know that burning fossil fuels emits carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. We know that we've burned a lot of fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution. Coal, oil, gas, and actually cement. I was surprised to find that in my reading, that cement is the 4th largest emitter of CO2 into the atmosphere. So we also know that the Earth has naturally occurring greenhouse gas effects. The sun's light shines down through the transparent blanket of the Earth's atmosphere and traps the gases, or traps heat-trapping gases. So this is the natural greenhouse gas effect. Our atmospheric CO2 is roughly 0.4%. So CO2 is a good thing. If we didn't have any CO2 in our environment, in our atmosphere, we would be 34 degrees centigrade colder. We would basically be a frozen ball in space, and there would be no life on Earth. So CO2 is not a bad thing, but we've got too much of it. We've gone up 43% from the Industrial Revolution. CO2 levels used to be in the 180 to 280 level. Now we're well over 400. 350.org's goal is to, you know, get to 350, but we passed that long ago. Bill McKibben, the head of 350, makes a comment that there's $22 trillion worth of fossil fuels in the ground that needs to stay there if we're going to stick with the Paris Accord of less than 2 degrees centigrade. And this is a a temperature record of what's happened. So we know the Earth is warming. And it's warming that changes our atmosphere and our climate. So this graph shows the temperature measurement since 1900 relative to the 1961-1990 average. So we know that there are naturally occurring factors that have an impact on our climate. We also know that according to these factors, we should actually be getting colder. The same scientist on my Audible book, Dr. Michael Weissession, a geophysicist at Washington University, stated that we were actually going into an ice age before the Industrial Revolution. But with all the fossil fuel consumption or burning, that's been altered. So in other words, we know it's not the sun. Over the last 35 years, the sun has actually shown a cooling trend, but we're getting warmer. We know it can't be natural cycles because the entire planet is warming. We know that based on the orbit of the Earth around the sun, we should be entering a cooling period and not heating up. So this is what our climate scientists are telling us. And this is a nice little graphic that kind of shows the 95 or 97% of the scientists are in the green. And if you look real closely, the red, there's a couple of little red leaves. Those represent the climate scientists that are not totally convinced in climate change, in the science of climate change. So we know the solution. And that's the other thing about CCLs. We're very solution driven. We don't think that it's a viable game plan to do nothing but talk about woe is me. This is a bad, we know it's a bad thing, but we do feel we have a viable solution to the problem. So if the problem is putting too many greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, then the solution is to stop putting them into the atmosphere. I'm happy to send your group a link to a podcast that I just listened to, a PhD economist from the Brookings Institute. They've done a pretty in-depth study, and they've found that they talk about decoupling the economic growth of countries and states versus decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. And there are 20 countries around the world they've documented that have had dramatic growth in their economies and a decrease in carbon emissions. In this country, we've had 33 states that have had dramatic increase in GDP and also a dramatic decrease in greenhouse gas emissions. So that kind of takes the wind out of the sails of people that say you can't have a growing economy and transition to renewable energy sources. So, and I think the state that's been most successful is Maine. I think their economy's grown by 30-some%, and they've dropped their carbon emissions by over 25% since 2005. So that's pretty impressive. So how can we price carbon? What's the CCL solution? I'm going to cover real quickly, there are a lot of proposals on the table. If you've been watching the news and reading, there's a Climate Leadership Council started by James Baker and George Shultz and Hank Paulson, the former CEO of Walmart, and several other economists. And they're putting forth a very similar plan to what we have, a carbon fee and dividend. And George Shultz is interesting. He's part of that group, and he's part of our group too. There's also, we could talk about the Prop 732 in Washington State that was defeated by 60 to 40% by the voters. We could talk about the California carbon fee and dividend. There's a lot of things on the table, but tonight I'm just going to talk strictly about CCL's carbon fee and dividend. It's kind of, we wouldn't have time to talk about it anyway, but that's something we can talk about later if anybody's interested. So our solution is called carbon fee and dividend. Some will ask too, does CCL focus on other issues like renewable research or fracking and different things like that? These are all important issues that I know you guys are working on probably as a group, but our leader, Mark Reynolds, says that passing federal level carbon tax is such a heavy lift. That's where our laser focus is. So that's all we do. We're a very focused group. So we believe that carbon fee and dividend, and I'm going to read a lot of this. I apologize for reading some of this stuff, but I want to make sure I'm giving it to you factually and not kind of making stuff up as I go. But we believe carbon fee and dividend makes fossil fuels accountable for their costs in the cleanest, fairest, and most transparent way. It's what economists and climate scientists alike have argued is the best first step we can take. So it has three parts. We call it a three-legged stool. And the first part is we place a fee on fossil fuels at the source, the well, the mine, the port. And this starts at $15 per ton of CO2 equivalent. And then it goes up $10 every year after that until basically it makes carbon so much more expensive. Right now, I think we supplement the carbon industry or the fossil fuel industry something like $18 billion a year. So it's not a level playing field at this point. So we put a fee on carbon. The next thing, all the money is collected and goes to a trust fund and returned to the American households with on a monthly equal basis. This is not a regressive tax. 70% of our population would actually be better off financially with a carbon fee and dividend than without it. So it's actually a good deal for 70% of the population. So it protects the poor and the middle class from higher prices. The final leg of the stool is a border tariff adjustment on goods imported from or exported to countries without an equivalent price on carbon. The adjustment would both discourage businesses from relocating to where they can emit more CO2 and encourage other nations to adopt an equivalent price on carbon. I can remember reading an article in The Economist several months ago, and if we don't do something like this, there are other countries that are going to impose a carbon tax on us for our imports. So this is a vital part of our carbon fee and dividend proposal. So this approach rewards producers, consumers, and other nations if they emit fewer greenhouse gases, which, if we remember from earlier, is the goal of our whole program. As far as who do we have behind us, the most vocal and ardent supporter of our carbon fee and dividend is Dr. James Hansen, former head of Goddard Institute, NASA Goddard Institute. He's on our advisory board. Dr. Hansen says the backbone of a solution to the climate problem is a flat carbon emission price. The carbon price must rise continuously at a rate that is economically sound, and the funds must be distributed back to the citizens and not to special interests. And our next big supporter, George Shultz, he's actually a trained economist. He was Secretary of State, but he's actually a trained economist. And George Shultz's comment is, we argue for revenue neutrality on the grounds that this tax should be exclusively for the purpose of leveling the playing field, not for financing some other government programs or for expanding the government sector. Also, the Grover Norquist, and I'm not a politician, but this is my best understanding, the Grover Norquist document basically means that the Republicans aren't going to raise taxes. They don't want to raise taxes. So the revenue neutrality of this is really important, and that's kind of what sunk the 732. Scott, am I correct in that? In Washington State, it had an adverse effect because they wanted it to do other things. So the revenue neutrality is important to the carbon fee and dividend. So we know that we've responded to similar threats in the past. When back in the 1980s, when George Shultz was the Secretary of State, and under Ron Reagan, we had the problem with the ozone layer, and Ronald Reagan was wise enough to put what they call an insurance policy. And basically, they were able to solve that problem. DuPont developed replacements for the substances that were destroying the ozone layer, and we avoided serious risks to humans. So what will carbon fee and dividend do? We rely a lot of our these decisions on a national group called REMI, Regional Economic Modeling Institute, or Incorporated. And they're basically an economic think tank. And they did a national and regional study of carbon fee and dividend. And the report detailed the project's impacts on a steadily rising fee and dividend on emissions, jobs and GDP, health, and household income. And this we can go through pretty quick too here, but we think that under a carbon fee and dividend plan, it will reduce carbon emissions within 10 years by 31%. And by 50% in 20 years. So that's the first part of it. We think that it'll create jobs, which is attractive to any politician. 2.1 million new jobs in the first decade, 2.8 million jobs within 20 years. So it's a job stimulator. We think that it'll grow the GDP, $70 to $85 billion per year. That's 1.3 some trillion in 20 years, I guess. So it's a growth stimulant. We think it's going to save lives. 13,000 people are estimated to die every year because of of fossil fuel-related emissions. So that's quite a few lives over a 20-year period. And then this is one of the big things that could be attractive to 70% of the population. After 10 years, the average household of 4 would get a check for $288 per month, and after 20 years, it'd be up to almost $400 per month. So that's attractive. And this is one of my favorite cartoons. What if it is a hoax? That's what some people feel climate change is. And what if it's a hoax and we create a better world for nothing at all? That's worst case. So who is Citizens Climate Lobby? I'm not going to cover a ton of that right now. I'll cover it kind of a thumbnail sketch, but I think if people are interested in Citizens Climate Lobby, there's an introductory call that I have a phone number for that later that people can listen to and get more educated. We have websites that just blow my mind. I get lost in the websites. There's so much information.
Just as an add-on, he and I will pass around the sign-up sheet. And it's not like radio that if you sign it, you're going to be besieged with offers. They'll send you a link to the website, and what we'll simply do is let you know when we're having meetings and what we're doing. So it's not a commitment, but if you're interested to learn more, we'll give you the websites and you can drill down on some of the things that Scott is saying.
Thank you, Scott. So about who we are, we're an international group, nonpartisan. We try to be nonpartisan. We're definitely nonprofit. We're solution focused. And once again, we show respect and appreciation and gratitude to all the politicians that we talk to, or anybody that we disagree with. Oops, where did I go here? Our vision is simple: a livable world. And our mission is how we're going to accomplish this vision: to create the political will for climate solutions by enabling individual breakthroughs in personal and political power. So how do we build political will? We do it through our volunteer group. We're definitely a volunteer-driven organization. Our founding member, Marshall Saunders, was actually part of a philanthropic group called Results, and they were giving third world loans to all around the world. And I think the story that he told, he watched Al Gore's movie Inconvenient Truth, and then realized they're doing third world loans to people in Bangladesh, and 180 million people will be underwater in the near future, potentially within our lifetime. So he transitioned from being a philanthropist for third world loans to starting the organization Citizens Climate Lobby in 2007. And so what do we do? What's the thrust? What's the the nuts and bolts of what we do? We do our best to meet with either members of Congress or their staffers. That's a big part of what we do. And these are outdated. 2015 is the latest we have here, but it's actually gone up from this. There was 1,231 in 2015. I wouldn't be surprised if it's close to 2,000 right now, especially after the latest election. There's a lot more interest in people getting involved. We write letters to the editor, and I wish I had a better mind for numbers, because I listened to our blog today, and our leader, Mark Reynolds, told us that incredible number of letters to the editor, op-eds, radio and TV, and all kinds of outreaches that are being done by CCL volunteers. Public speaking, what I'm doing right here, I'm way out of my comfort zone, so this is the thing that people get involved and they start tabling. There was an energy conference at the university 2 or 3 or 4 weeks ago. I'm not sure if anybody went to it, but I went to that and tabled there, and just, you just kind of get out there and talk to people. And then chapters. I know that says 308 in 2015. Our leader, Mark Reynolds, once again said we're up to 380 chapters. We lobby in every congressional district in the nation. And so our numbers are growing. We've got tens of thousands, I think. I don't know how many tens of thousands, but probably 30 to 40,000 members worldwide. I think there's something like 30 or 40 chapters in Canada, maybe one in Sweden. We work together in chapters, in groups. We spend a lot of the time educating ourselves, preparing and practicing as a team. That's what the CCL training does. You get a discussion, you go break up into discussion groups and try to find out how to talk to people and how to be persuasive, I guess. So what can I do? What can you do? Once again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, so this is probably you guys have already done this, but write your members of Congress. Send them letters. Get involved. In a place like Missoula, I mean, you've got Amy Sillenberg with Climate Smart. You've got 350 with Jeff Smith. You've got I'm on. You know, you get on these and you get on all these mailing lists. Organic consumers, and there's just an endless list. There's story of stuff. There's all these things that people can be involved in. So I guess that's my take-home message is that there's so many ways to get involved, and I think once again we have to double down and be involved. So to make some changes. This is our introductory call if anybody's interested. The 866-642-1665, and then there's a code 440699, and I think that's current. If it's not, then you know you can always find a way to get a hold of me or Scott, and we could tell you how to make more connections. So yeah, one of the things I do, this is one of the things that reminds me of why I do this, is my daughter and I, we went climbing down in the Tetons. I don't know if anybody's been down in that area, but it's a beautiful part of the world. But, you know, our world is not infinitely plastic. When I moved to Montana, a good friend of mine who's a PhD at the university told me that, and that's stuck with me for the last 20 years. The world is not infinitely plastic. And, you know, it can only bend so far. And once again, this just reminds me, this is my daughter here. She was a gymnast in high school, and she's as comfortable on her hands as she is on her feet. And it saved me a lot of money in shoes over the years. And this is an approach to Granite Peak last summer that we did. And I just wanted to close with, and this I'm kind of speaking out of school here because we once again try to stay nonpartisan and not controversial, but I just like this quote from Naomi Klein. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of Naomi Klein or read some of her books. This Changes Everything is one of her latest. We know that if we continue on our current path of allowing emissions to rise year after year, climate change will change everything about our world. Major cities will very likely drown, ancient cultures will be swallowed by the sea, and there's a very high chance that our children will spend a great deal of their lives fleeing and recovering from vicious storms and extreme droughts. And we don't have to do anything to bring this about. All we have to do is nothing. So, sorry about the PDA. Anyway, you guys have a wide net and a broad scope in your mission statement, and I know you guys are doing great things in your organization, and we're very focused with our carbon fee and dividend, but we believe it's our best hope for a solution to this climate crisis problem. So I look forward to our groups working together and all the other climate advocacy groups in Missoula and around the state and around the world, so to make this a livable planet. So thank you.
Go to do some questions. I guess we could just take them from the crowd here. So just stand up, say who you are, and ask away. And I'll take the first question. Oh, go ahead.
Scott, could I just get that number that you had with the phone number?
Oh, yeah. Can we go back? Just maybe just leave that up there. Yeah.
My question is going to be, what is President Obama's legacy on this? And is it true that that there's only a limited amount of activity that Trump can do to regress on what Obama did?
This is really, I hardly know where to begin. I wanted to say one thing before I answer the question. Most of us are petitioned and social movement fatigued at the moment. And we're all trying to figure out what to do. And I go to, as I'm sure you do, lots of other groups in town, and it's, what are we going to do? What are we going to do other than protest? So CCL, for me, it has, as Scott said, the other Scott, a focus. We want to work on a piece of legislation that has some psychological and economic reality behind it. We know that we don't price carbon. We know from behavioral economics that if we put a price on something, it changes behavior. This really pushes, the whole point of CCL and the fee and dividend is that it pushes us toward efficiency. It's a forced form of efficiency. Now, as for what Trump can undo, he's already undoing it. So one of the things I rely on heavily is a lot of the government research sites, because I was looking up information today from the United States Department of Agriculture. As I began in the morning and logged on to one site, by the time I went back to it in the afternoon, it was gone. And what was the information? It was simply information that the USDA keeps on organic agriculture. It was gone. Now, can Trump reverse the Paris Climate Accords? Absolutely. It's not a binding agreement. Now, will other countries try to shame us into doing so? Probably, but so far they've not had a lot of luck in moving this eccentric man from his positions. They're also talking about, so the EPA. The EPA is being gutted. Today, last week, it'll be cut. Budgets are being reduced. If I were invested in Tesla, I would sell it short now. Why? Because of the subsidies the federal government provides for electric cars. It is proposed that all of those subsidies be eliminated. So is Trump in a position with the cabinet officers he has appointed to begin to roll back the Obama legacy? Can't even get it out of my mouth. My lips are sticking together. You bet.
Okay, more questions? Maybe something a little more.
I have some questions that I anticipate being asked as I present this to people. One is, if the dividend is cycled back to consumers, won't that just obviate the increased cost that the tax in the first place would induce in consumer goods and gasoline? And how would it then have any effect on consumption?
Scott,
Seems like it would
we were
net.
talking about that on the way here.
Consumption and the tax. So some of you obviously drive large pickup trucks because it's related to your work. You go to the gas pump, you buy more gas than somebody driving a Prius. The money gets pulled, the person driving the Prius gets as much money back as do you based on the size of your household. The idea is that over a period of time, as the costs for carbon go up and the fee goes up, there's going to be an incentive to push back again to get increased fuel mileage, which won't have to be by a government mandate, but simply because people will be pushed to greater efficiencies. You lose money if you don't. It's also not a regressive tax because though low-income people spend a greater portion of their income on fuel and heating than does somebody who has an income of $200,000, $300,000, $500,000 a year. That other person is spending much more in terms of carbon tax. The other person ultimately will benefit more from it, but there has to be help in this process for people increasing the efficiency of their households and the efficiencies of the vehicles that they drive. I don't know if that answers your question.
Partially.
Wasn't trying to avoid it.
No. Second question that I've been, when I discuss this with my, and why this has been politicized is beyond me, but with my Republican friends, the new party line seems to be, well, yeah, the climate's changing, but that's a natural cycle, and yeah, our carbon emissions may or may not have an effect on it, but we need maybe 50 or 100 years more study before we take any action because we're not really sure how much that effect is. How do you answer the argument, and you touched on it very briefly, that these are natural cycles that would occur with or without human activity?
The problem in talking about climate change is there's so many alternative facts. So Scott started out by talking about the way in which the Earth operates. It wobbles, it tilts, and its orbit around the sun changes. That affects the climate. As it stands now, we ought to be, as he said, in a cooling period. When I've been on the air in another state talking about climate change, I'll get phone calls such as, well, CO2's good. It causes trees to grow. We're going to have even more trees and they'll suck up more of the CO2 and everything will balance out. So what's the problem with this? And furthermore, we're going to be able to raise sheep and cattle in Greenland. It's a standard question, but then the answer to it is, well, here's what's going to happen in other areas of the country. Right now, in California, agriculturalists are trying to figure out how to move crops north. Wheat cropping is continuing to move north as we speak. Talk to anybody that collects seeds, and they will tell you that they're collecting them earlier and earlier. People who actively pollinate plants know that the climate is changing. So you've got to have a story that counters this, and unless they take down the site, the National Academy of Sciences has a detailed list in which they go through these alibis. Well, it's not really that bad. It's only going to take 100 years, and by then the technology will take care of it. They answer every one of those questions. So, in a way, when we're trying to talk to our friends, I wrote a book on climate change, and I did so because one of my friends made me so mad. He listened to Rush Limbaugh, and he'd say, well, it's solar radiation. And I'd go home and I'd shake my head and I'd come back and I'd say, no, Marshall, it's not solar radiation. Well, the Earth is getting warmer naturally, and then I'd have to explain that. So I ended up explaining to this person in a bar and having to educate myself on all of, not the climate science, which is really pretty straightforward, but on all of the bizarre questions that people had, so that I could debate my Republican friends. Also, though some of them will just say, because the issue of climate change is more divisive than the issue of abortion. So if you've got a friend that you can, across the political aisle, that you can talk to about abortion, you're doing pretty good. Getting to talk about climate change is hard because it's not in my backyard. It's going to cost me money. I don't want to live in the dark. I don't want to go back to the Stone Age. You're just trying to take away my money, and I don't have any kids anyhow. So my answer is, it's not easy. And you really have to educate yourself using some of the standard websites and the CCL website to do this. Your turn.
Well, I mean, the Republican Party should feel fairly lonely because I don't know how many countries signed the climate or the Paris Accord, but 93. So we've got 93 countries, and then we've got the Democrat Party, and then and all believe in man-made climate change to one degree or another, and then you've got the Republican Party that don't believe in it. So as far as the science, I mean, it's not, if you have a friend that you know that is a scientist, ask them, and they will tell you that yes, 97% of the climate scientists are right. I listen to a physicist, and once again, we're solution-oriented, not doomsday-oriented, but I listened to a physicist talk in Salt Lake City, and his research talks about acidification of the oceans. And if we acidify the ocean, and if you kill all the phytoplankton, and if you don't have any production of oxygen through our oceans, the lungs of the world, you know, if you like to breathe, that's not a good thing. So there are some dire things that can and will happen. Not necessarily to us, you know, but to our children and our grandchildren. Yes.
Can you tell us more about the Congressional Climate Caucus that you mentioned? Are you optimistic that it will keep growing and maybe have some legislative power at some point?
Yeah, I mean, it is growing. The blog I listened to just today, they're up to 30 members now. And they they tongue-in-cheek call it the Noah's Ark, because it's got to be 2 by 2. It's got to be, you can't be on it as a Democrat unless you bring a Republican along with you. So now they have 15 Democrats and 15 Republicans on the climate caucus. It was started by Carlos Curbelo, a Republican from Miami County in Florida. And so most of the Republicans that are on board are Republicans that live on coastal states, because they're the ones that are getting the heat from their constituencies. So yeah, we just need to keep the heat on our politicians. Because, like we said, if we're not talking to them, somebody is. So they need to hear from us on a regular basis. I listened to a blog the other day and said, just put in your phone the speed dial of your Republican congressman and call them every day. Brush your teeth and call your congressman. Leave a message.
What better to write a letter?
Or write a letter, yeah.
It makes more difference, makes a greater difference, as you probably know. They count the letters and the phone calls, sometimes you just can't simply, right now, you can't get through.
Yeah. Go ahead, yeah.
So I guess my question may have been answered kind of, but I wanted to clarify so I have a better understanding. As someone who has a small business where we help people with mental health symptoms in this community, I'm aware of poverty at an extreme level in the city. People can't get to their appointments because of lack of money. So what you're proposing, what I'm understanding, is that when you talk about making it essentially harder for people to pay for their fuel, their heat, for example, as someone who works with people in poverty, how do you want to shape that so that the majority of Montanans can get behind it without actually being afraid of what you're proposing? Because for somebody that just gets an extra $400 and they actually are making plenty of money, it's really not that big of a deal for them. And so they put up their solar panels and they do all the things, they get their Prius, for example. But for one of my clients who is driving an old beat-up pickup truck that they can barely afford to fill up with gas and can barely afford to heat and still pay for food for their family, what can I say to someone like that who is a Republican for their fear-based reasons that are real for them because they're in poverty, which is the state of much of Montana. That's what I'm interested in hearing, how I would convince someone like that.
Well, I mean, one, I like a point of reference, and we talk about the first year, the carbon fee and dividend would tack on $15 per ton of CO2. So what does that translate to in a day-to-day life? Each dollar translates to 1 penny per gallon of gas. So if you add $15 per ton of CO2 equivalent, that means your gallon of gas is going to cost you 15 cents more. Now, and I'm relying on the economists, the George Schultzes of the world and the Remy studies of the world that tell us that 70% of the population, which would probably include most of your clients, they would actually make more money on this than they would lose. Their carbon fees, what they use would go up, but according to the studies that I've read, they would actually be better off with a carbon fee and dividend than without it. Is that a fair statement, Scott?
That would be that they would distribute to them.
Right. The idea is on our plan, every American household would get a check every month that would come through the Treasury. And you lose for administrative fees a percent to, I don't know what percent, but a very small percent. But none of it goes to taxes, none of it goes to solar research, none of it goes to anything else. It goes right back into the pockets of the American households. So it actually 70%, the only people that would take a little bit of a hit would be the upper 30%.
I was just going to make a comment on your senators and representatives. You can call Washington, D.C. for hours and nothing will happen. But the local offices have to count every call, every email, and every letter that comes in. And that's what I do for nonprofit groups is how do you lobby? And it's really simple. You call the local office, you call the state offices, and you try and get through to national. And it works. And I'm ironically now on a first name basis with a Republican person Dane's office for the first time. But that's what you do. And we did 600 phone calls to Rebirth to get that trail off between Missoula and Lolo in 3 days. He didn't come out and say, oh, look for it, I'll write a letter. But he did go over and talk to the Department of Transportation. And it was basically phone calls to the local office. Because a letter can take 6 weeks to get to Washington, D.C. But when you're talking time, pick up and call the local office because they have to get that information to the national.
And I don't think we can emphasize too much the fact that no matter how much you disagree, you have to be respectful, appreciative, because most of these people are they differ in our worldview, but they're good people, I think, at heart. I think we've got an honest disagreement. And maybe there's some other things there, but I think you have no choice but to be respectful and appreciative of what they do. Otherwise, it ends the discussion.
Couple more questions?
Well, this is just a comment. I give climate change presentations as well around the country. And I found that it was difficult to convince people based solely on physical data like CO2 or temperature until I converted it to what the biological impacts are. And that seemed to resonate. I deal with folks who like fish and wildlife, so I look at what their passion is. They say, this is what happens to trout, salmon, dungeness crab, whatever, waterfowl. That resonates and they grasp it more easily, and there's much less disagreement. And typically I say, wow, it's real after all, what do we do? But if I go in with this CO2 curve or the hockey stick or whatever by itself, I don't get anywhere.
Right.
They have to see what the impacts are down the line, the things that mean a lot to them personally.
Right. Right.
Couple more comments?
I have a comment. Montana has a particularly difficult problem there because of the coast. And what do you do about the people who work and live in the coast there? How can we find a way to have with an alternative employment? It's very difficult when a certain group of society it has a heavy dependence on something which, for the larger society, is not desirable. I had a conversation years ago with the head of Montana Power Company, and at that time he was talking about having nuclear power plants as a primary source of energy. Of course, it doesn't have the carbon problem, but it has an additional problem in that we don't seem to have any practical means of getting rid of the residual stuff, and we aren't willing to bury it under heat out of that.
Right.
So this is since Montana was born basically on a thirst for digging in the ground for one kind of rich ore or another.
Right.
Of course, the carbon thing doesn't go back all that far. The first actual digging that resulted in a big plume of oil was in Pennsylvania in my lifetime. And we weren't using carbon at all before that. And of course, we're using it up so fast that maybe the problem will solve itself, even though we won't be around anymore to take advantage of it, because we will use up all of those organic chemicals.
Right.
And we're using them up in the worst possible way. We burn. Oil has complicated organic chemicals in it that were developed from life forms in the past, and we could make much better use.
Yeah.
So you can one argument is we're stealing this from our grandchildren.
Right.
If we're going to use it in a different way. and not so rapidly
Yeah.
as we are doing.
You can give us our next question.
But I'm glad you asked that because that's one of I think the most important questions that should be asked and answered. And I went with the 350.org group to the Pacific Northwest. They did a kind of a protest over there last spring. And I was in a bar with a friend, and we were there. We were kind of known as outsiders, and there was actually blockades going on. I don't know if you read about this in the news with the 350.org group. And a big guy sat down at our table, put his elbows on the table, and said, "Are you guys with the protest?" And I thought, well, I can run faster than Jim, so I'm going to say, yeah, we are. So, and we ended up having a really nice discussion about the fact that he relies on the refineries to feed his family, to go on vacations, to send his kids to school. So these are all really relevant questions. There's got to be a transition, and once again, I don't have all the details on that, but I know that Bernie Sanders has a thing called just transition legislation that he's putting forward. I think another way to look at it is if we lose our coal economy, which has something like 1,300 jobs in the state, although they probably pay very well. We've got something like 11 or 12,000 recreation tourism jobs in the state of Montana. So if we lose the glaciers, if we lose our rivers, if the Yellowstone River shut down again next year and we lose our the guides don't have work, it's a trade-off and there's a transition, and I'm not saying there won't be some pain in any transition. So yeah, I don't think there's any way to do this without some kind of bumps in the road. But I think the reason we're here, because we're looking at the alternatives, which can be also very, very bleak. And so there's definitely some obstacles that have to be overcome.
Okay, sorry. Two last questions. Make it real quick. Are there questions, please? Nick and the...
So the dividend part of this seems pretty genius, not only from sort of an economic justice standpoint, but also from a potential populist standpoint, right? Are you guys counting on that part of it to sort of break the will? Because honestly, you can call it a fee, but the right is going to see it as a tax, right? And they hate taxes as much as they love fossil fuels, right? But it seems to me from a political standpoint, the fact that 70% of the population is going to be getting dividends from this could create this populism that could break that eventually, that sort of stranglehold that's happening now. Do you think that can happen now, or do we have to wait until the climate gets better in Washington?
I mean, I don't know. I can't remember who said. I think Bill McKibben or somebody said the whole fossil fuel industry is the largest market failure in the history of mankind, because once again we're giving $18 billion a year in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, and so they're not going to give up and leave $22 trillion of fossil fuels in the ground without a fight. And you've got the Rush Limbaughs in the world that I like to listen to Rush just because, keep your friends closer and your enemies closer. I like to listen to Rush just to know what kind of things he's talking about.
But does that apply to Alex Jones?
What's that?
Alex Jones, can you go there?
I don't know who that is. I don't know who that is. Oh, I don't know who that is. Oh, okay.
Last question. I've already called questions.
It's not a question, it's a simple statement.
Sure.
In addressing these fellows' questions about jobs and loss of jobs with fossil fuels, you guys may consider looking at job growth with energy efficiency and renewable energy.
Could you speak up just a little? I'm sorry, I have a little bit of a hearing problem.
Efficiency and renewable energy jobs, if you looked at the data in this country, particularly over the last 8 years, obviously because of the administration, but even the 8 years of administration prior to that, job growth in those markets is significant and has the opportunity to replace the jobs that are lost from the fossil fuel industry, and proper policy addresses that transition and that growth. Look at states like Colorado, Washington, California. They've addressed these issues by preparing new jobs and new workforces and taking those folks who are going to lose their jobs with the next generation of those folks and training them for it.
Right. Yeah, thank you for saying. And I think that's part of it. I mean, they talk about 2.1 million jobs in a decade and 2.8 million jobs in 20 years. So I think they're probably including those kind of jobs in that whole statistic. But yeah, thank you.
We'll take a 5-minute break, and then if you have additional questions, please come on. But join me in thanking our...
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate your expertise. I appreciate your expertise. Yeah.